This movie, Disney's Lion King, might be the most well-known film about Africa here in the US. Or at least until this movie came out. But those movies show fictionalized worlds, animals who talk, superheroes. What about the other kinds of movies? What about historical films? You know, those that purport to show a real Africa. What does that Africa look like? Who lives there? And what, or who, is hidden from our view? I'm a student at Yale, and one of my professors, a man named Daniel Magaziner, this guy right here in the video clip, he mentioned one of these movies in particular, it's called Out of Africa, released in 1985, as a film that particularly irked him. So I looked it up, and it turns out that the movie was a hit. Like a huge hit. Even though it got mostly mixed reviews, Rotten Tomatoes only gives it a 60%, it's not even certified fresh, it won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Why? And why did Dan Magaziner hate it so much? I mean, clearly somebody's wrong here. So I sat down and watched the movie for myself. And I think I figured out the answer. The film opens with beautiful landscapes that sit in front of our eyes for a long time, so we can soak them in. And before I say anything else, I will say that this film is stunningly beautiful. It's one of the most visually incredible experiences I've ever had watching a movie. But it doesn't mean that the movie doesn't have problems. So, the movie starts, and we see savannah and a hot sun. If you've seen any other movies that take place in Africa, and I'll unpack that idea in a second, the idea of a movie taking place in Africa, these are all the traditional indicators that say, yep, here we are, this is Africa. And Meryl Streep's character, Baroness Karen Blixen, says it over and over again as soon as the movie starts.
I had a farm in Africa at the foot of the Ngong Hills. I had a farm in Africa.
It's how we're introduced to the plot. And it very quickly becomes apparent that this film is trying very hard to set a particular tone. We, as the audience, are meant to understand that this is going to be a film about Africa. And that means it'll be beautiful, and it'll be lush, and it'll be wild. But already there's a problem. Because what does it mean for a movie to take place in Africa? You know, it reminds me of something Dan Magaziner, that professor I was talking about, said in a class I took with him called African Encounters with Colonialism. Probably the best class I ever took, by the way. At the end of the course, on the very last day, he talked about a course review he'd gotten from a student once, in which the kid said, "This was a great class, I learned a lot, but there's just one problem. I still don't know how to talk about Africa." And I'll never forget, he told us that story, and then he just looked at us and said, why should they know how to talk about Africa? Africa was never just one thing. And you know, I think that's the real problem with movies that claim to take place in Africa. When a movie takes place in New York City, for example, do we say it takes place in North America? The answer is of course not. You know, often we're so specific that we even say which neighborhood in New York City. Think about this guy, Spider-Man, for example. We know he's from Queens, we know where his house is, we know the streets he walks on. But because we think of Africa as just one thing, we don't care exactly where it takes place. As long as we see the traditional markers that tell us we're in Africa, we're happy, because that's what we're looking for. Out of Africa takes place in what is now Kenya, by the way, but in 1913, when the country was the British East Africa Protectorate. The plot of the movie goes something like this. Karen Blixen is a wealthy Danish woman, and she has a lover who's a Swedish nobleman. He decides he's not interested in her anymore, though, He's really casual and rude about it, too. It kind of sucks. And so, Karen decides to marry his brother, Bror, and they start a farm in the highlands to the north of Nairobi. This is historically accurate, too, by the way. It's kind of crazy. A British law, the Crown Lands Ordinance of 1902, said that only Europeans could live in the central uplands of Kenya. It's those areas highlighted in the brightest green on the map. Eventually, they started calling it the White Highlands because of that. And if you were an indigenous Central Kenyan, you were out of there. The colonial government wasn't interested in your community or your attachment to place. Of course not. And, not surprisingly, this was the best place for anybody to live. It was temperate, and it was the best place to grow crops. So, back to the plot. Karen and Bror start life on the plantation, and soon, Karen starts to interact with people who are actually native to the area. But she only does so in a particular context, as their employer, as their overseer. Pretty much the only indigenous people we see in this movie are the laborers who work on Karen's farm. And they're always dressed in very traditional clothing. And that's another thing. In Out of Africa, we never see black Africans dressed in Western clothing. There are only two kinds of people in this movie: whites and non-whites. There's no in between. We see some people who appear to be Indian, and that's historically accurate, but they're pretty much just lumped in with everybody else who isn't white. So, what's the problem with that? The problem is that it completely twists the historical narrative. It flattens history. A little bit of historical background is necessary here. Most British possessions in Africa were administered through a system called indirect rule. That meant that the British colonial government ruled through authorities that were already in place, namely chiefs. So chiefs became basically colonial government bureaucrats who now owed their existence to the colonial power, not to the people that they ruled over. And in addition to that, and this is the part I was getting at earlier, a new class of people emerged. Black Africans who came to own property, who relied on the hierarchies created by Europeans. People like Jomo Kenyatta. He, by the way, eventually became president of Kenya, basically because the British were wary of having someone more radical in power than he was. But a lot of people hated Jomo Kenyatta because he, and the chiefs, represented a class of people that relied on European structures, relied on European hierarchy for their own fortunes. But there's none of that in this movie. No Kenyans who own property. No Jomo Kenyattas. All right, back to the plot one last time. Eventually, Karen finds out that Bror is cheating on her, she breaks up with him, and she falls in love with Dennis, played by Robert Redford, who takes her all around the protectorate and shows her huge expanses of land. And that's the part of the film that really fascinates me, its use of physical space. Because this movie is obsessed with physical space, with land. When you watch the movie, it feels like 50% of it is just landscape shots. And it's spectacular, I'll be the first to admit that, but it's wrong. Because where are the people who lived here before? Once Dan Magaziner said that in Out of Africa, the whole continent is just a place for white people to go and play. And he couldn't have been more right. Somehow, even when Karen and Dennis fly across the entire protectorate, they don't see a single indigenous person on the ground. They see animals, of course. If you make a movie about Africa, you have to have animals. But never a single person. This isn't a real Africa. This, to me, isn't even an attempt to create something even resembling Africa. They might as well have filmed it on a stage. An integral part of any land is the people who live there, but in this movie, there aren't any. Finally, here's how the movie ends. Take a listen.
If I know a song of Africa, of the giraffe and the African new moon lying on her back, of the plows in the fields and the sweaty faces of the coffee pickers, does Africa know a song of me? Will the air over the plain quiver with a color that I have had on? Or will the children invent a game in which my name is or the full moon throw a shadow over the gravel of the drive that was like me? Or will the eagles of the Ngong Hills look out for me?
Now, this strange poetic fetishization of Africa really encapsulates my central criticism of the movie. It doesn't treat its setting like a real place. This movie has no idea that people lived real lives here in the East Africa Protectorate. That they lived, worked, laughed, died, that they had families, that the places where they were born and died had names. For Karen, Africa exists to be a fantasy and to be remembered in a song, and that's it. I hope that one day I find a movie that does things differently. I loved Black Panther, for example, but Black Panther doesn't take place in the real world. Why do we need an African man to be a high-tech superhero in order for there to be a movie made about him? I want a movie that acknowledges the reality of the people who really lived and died in colonial Africa, while the Karen Blixens of the world sang about the memories they made there. That's the movie I want to see. But I haven't found it yet.